Greetings, all. Today, I want to talk about planting things in groups. I frequently get comments from visitors here on the farm, and now that goes back to California, Wisconsin, too, about, Bill, most people plant their trees in straight rows with so much spacing between the trees and the rows and all that, looking like a farm orchard. And, well, you don't do that. You get stuff planted all over the place. Well, it's sort of a long story, but originally I did plant things, I think, the way most people do, in straight rows, one at a time. But going back to the mid-1970s, I know I was inspired by a book by Masanobu Fukuoka, One Straw Revolution. Yeah, I was impressed, although he was in Japan, had a very different climate that was probably much more similar to what I have here today in Hawaii. I was in Wisconsin, and so most of what he did could not be duplicated where I was at. But I took the basic ideas that, originally, I guess when we started agriculture a long time ago, well, for a lot of us, I guess in Northern Europe, that meant cereal grain, especially barley or oats. In the Middle East, maybe wheat. And these were grains that grew wild in various areas, and they were not necessarily that abundant. They were in small groups, small patches. Well, someone got the idea, gosh, if we took all this seed, gathered it up, and then planted it all in one location, we wouldn't have to walk all over the countryside trying to find ourselves some barley. And so they did. And, they would do that by disturbing the ground eventually. They figured out to break the soil, plant the seeds, and of course the seeds would be then planted in a solid mat. And they'd have one crop, a monoculture, growing, usually in rather small patches in those days, but they'd have a group of same plants that made harvest easy. Well, that's how it got going. Somewhere along the line, I do believe the Greeks noticed that the plants seemed to grow better in landslides than they did otherwise. And so they began turning the soil constantly every time they planted to simulate a landslide and so on. That's kind of how we got where we are today. Well, somewhere along the line, somebody started to look at it and go, maybe instead of tearing nature apart, maybe we should be putting nature back together again. Because, plants do grow in associations with one another. There are very seldom do you find in nature a solitary specimen, the only thing that grows. Most times the plants have relationships between themselves. They have relationships with other organisms like fungi and such, and they have guilds. That's the term they use in permaculture. I was told the first time a permaculturist showed up at my place in California that I was a permaculturist. Oh, is that so? Well, it depends on how you define things, I suppose. But Christopher Shine, he was a permaculture instructor at Merritt College in Oakland, and he'd requested bringing some of his students by and looking at my stuff. And that was the immediate reaction. They said, "Man, this is permaculture, what you do." Basically what they meant is I had things planted in guilds. If we have a tree, a tree's up the center, well then beneath and around the tree you will find that you generally in nature will have some sort of vine or subshrub that grows like a raspberry. Okay, for instance, good example, that you'll find in the partial shade near the edges of the tree's canopy and around the tree. Out and beyond that, you'll find grasses and forbs that grow. And all of these things grow in associations with one another, and they grow in layers. Your grasses and your ground covering plants are down here, the raspberries are up here, the trees are up there, the vines climb to get the sunlight, and so on. Well, this is what the plants do naturally. And we kind of disassembled it. We took it apart to make our agriculture, and there's reasons, as I say, why we did that. But today, a lot of us are turning it back around, and we are starting to put nature back together again. That was how I got started planting things in groups. But over time, I found there were at least 2 other excellent reasons why you might do this. Before I move on to my present condition here in Hawaii, I want to mention that back in northern Wisconsin, we would get periodically late spring frosts. Yeah. And a lot of plants were tender to it. Walnut. I like growing American black walnut. I also grew a collection of some of the kiwi that were released from the Soviet Union during the Reagan administration. And all of these were somewhat frost tender. A walnut tree is as frost tender as a tomato plant. They don't come out early. But sometimes the weather would get warm, they'd pop out, they'd start growing, and all of a sudden we'd get a May frost, and it just burned them poor things. Terrible. Well, I finally figured out that if I planted walnuts, if I planted kiwis in and around and underneath quaking aspen, it's in Wisconsin they call it popple. It's a poplar tree. In the West, it's called quaking aspen. You know, this bright yellow leaves on the mountainsides. They use it for paper pulp. It's a fast-growing tree in the primary tree succession. It doesn't live long in nature, but they come up real quick. And I started planting walnuts and kiwi beneath and around the poplar trees as they popped up. In the evenings, when we would start to get cold air settling, the quaking aspen leaves would tremble like this. This is what they call them, trembling aspen. Sometimes they're quaking aspen. They'd flutter, even when there didn't seem to be any breeze, just from air moving up and down through the canopies of the tree. Well, what they did was they created a sort of a convection current that kept frost from settling under the trees, and the walnuts wouldn't freeze when the walnuts were planted in groups with the poplar tree, you see. I started using a few other plants, like regular blackberry was pretty tender in that climate, and so I would use my blackberries the same way. Well, later on, I was out smallmouth bass fishing in high summer on the South Fork Flambeau River, and it had been slow fishing and kind of hot weather. I'd been sitting in my canoe for just too long. I got tired of it, and I come on a sandbar in the middle of the river, and so I beached my canoe. I jumped out and I stretched my legs and cast off the sandbar, and I'm out there fishing for bass. And well, I looked down, and all around down the sandbar is gathered sprouted seeds for the silver maple tree. Silver maple is a very common tree in the eastern United States along water courses. This is a tree that loves high water tables, rivers, streams, and so on. And the area where I was at, the banks were very much lined with silver maples. And they had seeded, and the seeds were everywhere. I looked down, I said, well, I was growing some trees. I'd been raising walnut seedlings for sale. I said, well, it's a good opportunity. I think I'll take some of these. I took my tackle bag and I shoved it full of sprouted maple seeds. When I went home, I stuck them along the edge of one of my raspberry patches to grow them up as seedlings. I intended to sell them either bare root or potted later on, and I did with most of them. But I didn't get them all dug out in time, and what happened is one of them got rather large and became tree-like right in the middle of my raspberries. Well, later I moved the raspberries, but I was going to take a chainsaw and cut the thing down and just get it out of there when my youngest, or oldest son rather, toddler at the time, wrapped his hand around the tree, looked at me and said, "No, my tree dead." Oh, God, here we go. All right, so your tree, fine. And yeah, as time went on, as soon as he could swing a hammer, he was up in his silver maple, nailing boards. The tree grew as faster than the child did. Those are really quick trees. Anyway, over time, so I had this big old tree sitting out there in an area where I usually grew some food. Well, I started planting gooseberry shrubs around it. I started planting tomatoes on the edges of it, basil, various herbs and things under the canopy of this tree. I was trying to work with a lot of perennials, but I had a few annuals in the mix too. And well, this was, again, inspired by One Straw Revolution. Masanobu Fukuoka would use Satsuma mandarins as trees, and then beneath them he would grow vegetables, Chinese vegetables, Japanese vegetables. Yeah, so that's what I did. And, well, I noticed something real fast. Silver maple is a water tree. They love water. They love to grow with half their root system under the river. Well, they are massive hydraulic pumps, because it started getting a little bit dry in late summer and we weren't getting rain. Next thing I knew was almost everything around my silver maple was beginning to wilt. Herbs were wilting, tomatoes were wilting. Why? Because the maple had pumped so much water out of the soil in a circle around that tree that it literally was droughting the other plants out. Not every tree does this. An oak tends to be deeply tap-rooted. Walnuts are deeply tap-rooted. They'll reach for water definitely deeper in the soil. The silver maple is not. It's a superficial thing, and it drinks like crazy, and so I just sucked all the water right up. Well, that was a problem at the time. I had to come about ways of adjusting to it. Mostly I used only other woody perennial plants. I stopped trying to grow tomatoes and basil and stuff around that tree. Well, then I ended up here in Pune. Yeah, and YouTube folks, y'all drop by here often and take a walk around the farm, and it's quite frequently I'll get this comment: Bill, you plant things in groups, you plant things close together, you have clumps of plants here and there. Well, it's kind of the way I taught myself how to do business, because, again, emulating nature. Okay, rather than emulating what I see the guys in the farm fields do, I look at the way the world works on its own, and that's kind of the way I associate things. The vanilla orchids are dangling in the avocados, the anthuriums and pineapples are down around the bottom of them, and taro growing in the low spots at the base of the trees, and so on. Well, it rains a lot here. Excess water is definitely a problem at times in Pune. There are times when we get way too much. Well, I had trouble, for instance, growing papayas up here, because the papayas, the soil would get too wet, and the papayas would get a root rot, and they'd die. Avocado, sort of same thing, too. And it's kind of sensitive to root rotting. You get over wet, plants will rot. Well, without thinking about what I was doing, sometimes the clumps of plants or groups of plants I have around here didn't happen because I planned them. Sometimes I just dug my kitchen trash in, and I ended up with a bunch of avocados, papayas, and chili peppers all growing together, And, I realized real fast that the papayas grew much better when they were in association with chilies and with avocado tree. Yes, I have a group over here, 1 avocado tree, 6 papayas, and about 4 chili plants, all in a circle. Well, what I noticed real quick, the papayas were surviving because the grouping of the plants was sucking up the excess water. Yeah, water, too much water can be trouble here. Well, when you're planting things in groups, plants are hydraulic pumps, and they will suck excess water out of the soil, use it, and then respirate it back into the atmosphere. And if you have enough plants in a given area, they can really suck up a lot of water. Massive hydraulic pumps. I know one of the guys who used to work for me in California, Chad, he has property over here, and well, he'd gone ahead and spread some of the muck that they call soil that was there on his property after he got done ripping and grading and so on. Well, he covered it up with weed block or plastic or something, and boy, oh boy, it is just mucky, messy, awful, messy. It's just terrible. He was considering the possibility of scraping it all back off, but well, I guess Greg Adams, my dragon fruit farming buddy, was over there looking at it for him, and Greg says, "Why don't you plant it?" Yeah, he says, "Yeah, the plants will suck up the excess water, and the muck thing will go away," which I agree with that entirely. You know, fill it with perennial peanut and just get some grass seed or something and sow it on it. But the more vegetation around here you have in one given area, and vegetation in different guilds too. I'm talking a tree up here, papaya there, chili bushes here, perennial peanut down there, you know, layers of plants all in one given area. They will solve some of the water problems for you naturally when you start planting things in groups. Yeah, this is not the best place in the world for planting things in solitary rows, you know, a plant and a plant and a plant. Now, some things absolutely love water, like corn. Doesn't matter. I plant my corn in rows, you know. The bananas, they're a little bit overbearing because they spread, and same thing with bamboo. I kind of just let them be on their own. All right. But other things that don't spread so aggressively will cohabitate with one another and create a nice association where things are probably just going to work better for you than if you tried planting things in nice, well-spaced groups like you see in a conventional farm field. Well, there we have it for today. Yeah. Hang loose, folks. Have a good one.